The morning sun of October 23, 1944, cast long shadows across the Philippine Sea as Admiral William Frederick Halsey, Jr. stood on the bridge of the USS New Jersey. His weathered hands gripped the railing as he surveyed the vast expanse of the Pacific, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, the Imperial Japanese Navy was making its final, desperate gamble. The fate of the Philippines and perhaps the entire Pacific War would be decided in the waters ahead. For 3 years, the Japanese had been retreating across the Pacific, island by island, leaving behind a trail of destroyed airfields and sunken ships. Now, as General Douglas MacArthur's forces prepared to land on Leyte, the Japanese High Command had devised Operation Victory No. 1, a complex, four-pronged naval assault designed to destroy the American invasion fleet and turn the tide of war. It was a plan born of desperation, requiring the sacrifice of Japan's remaining carriers as decoys, while their most powerful battleships attempted to reach the vulnerable transport ships. In Leyte Gulf, the American intelligence network had been tracking Japanese naval movements for weeks. Radio intercepts and submarine reports painted a picture of massive fleet movements converging on the Philippines. Admiral Chester William Nimitz, from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, coordinated the American response with methodical precision. The Third Fleet under Halsey and the Seventh Fleet under Admiral Thomas Casson Kincaid represented the most powerful naval force ever assembled in the Pacific. Over 250 ships, including 17 fleet carriers and 6 fast battleships. As the USS Darter, an American submarine patrolling the Palawan Passage, detected the approaching center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, the stage was set for what would become the largest naval battle in history. Captain David McClintock peered through the periscope at the impressive sight. Before him, 5 battleships, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, accompanied by heavy cruisers and destroyers, all steaming toward their rendezvous with destiny. The first torpedo salvo from the Darter struck the heavy cruiser Otago at 0-6-30 hours, sending Admiral Kurita's flagship to the bottom of the Sibian Sea. The explosion that tore through the ship's hull was heard 20 miles away, a thunderous announcement that the Battle of Leyte Gulf had begun. Within minutes, the submarine Dace joined the attack, torpedoing the cruiser Maya, which disappeared beneath the waves in a massive fireball that lit up the pre-dawn darkness. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive history of United States naval operations in World War II, these opening submarine attacks disrupted Japanese communications and forced Admiral Kurita to transfer his flag to the battleship Yamato, causing crucial delays in the enemy's coordinated assault. The Japanese plan required split-second timing and flawless execution. The northern force under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would lure Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf using Japan's remaining aircraft carriers as bait. Meanwhile, the southern force would approach through Surigao Strait, and Kurita's battered center force would fight through the San Bernardino Strait to attack the invasion beaches at dawn on October 25th. But as the morning progressed and damage reports flooded in, it became clear that the carefully orchestrated Japanese plan was already beginning to unravel. The element of surprise was lost, and the American forces were mobilizing with devastating efficiency. The second day of battle dawned with ominous clouds gathering over the Sibian Sea. As if nature itself sensed the approaching carnage, Admiral Kurita's center force, still reeling from the submarine attacks of the previous day, now faced a new and even more terrifying threat wave after wave of American carrier aircraft launched from Task Force 38's fast carriers. At 0810 hours, the first airstrike of 260 aircraft from the carriers Intrepid, Cabot, and Independence appeared on the horizon like a swarm of angry hornets. Leading the attack was Commander David McCampbell, already an ace pilot with 19 confirmed kills, who would add to his legendary status in the coming hours. The sight that greeted the American aviators was breathtaking, the pride of the Japanese battle line, steaming in formation with the mighty Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, leading the column like a floating fortress. The Musashi, at 72,800 tons when fully loaded, was the embodiment of Japanese naval power. Her 18.1-inch guns could hurl shells weighing over 3,000 pounds, more than 25 miles, and her armor was designed to withstand the most powerful naval guns afloat. But armor designed to stop shells was no match for the precision bombing and torpedo attacks that now descended from the sky. The first bomb struck the Musashi's forward deck, sending geysers of flame and debris skyward. Her anti-aircraft guns replied with a thunderous barrage, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke and deadly shrapnel. Several American aircraft fell victim to the defensive fire, but for every plane shot down, 10 more pressed home their attacks with devastating effect. Commander Hugh Winters, flying a hell-ever-dive bomber from the USS Lexington. The explosion was magnificent and terrible, he would later write in his combat report. The entire forward section of the ship seemed to lift out of the water, and when the smoke cleared, her pagoda mast was listing at a crazy angle. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, 5 separate airstrikes hammered the Japanese fleet. The Musashi absorbed an incredible punishment: 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits. Yet she continued to steam forward, her guns still firing. Her captain, Rear Admiral Toshihira Inoguchi, refused to abandon ship even as water poured through dozens of holes in her hull. The heavy cruiser Myoko, struck by the torpedoes, fell out of formation and began a long journey back to Brunei, trailing oil and listing heavily to port. The battleship Yamato herself took to bomb hits, though her massive armor plating prevented serious damage. But it was the Musashi that bore the brunt of the American fury, becoming the focus of attack after attack. As the afternoon wore on, the great battleship's list became more pronounced. Her forward turrets, each weighing more than a destroyer, began to touch the water. Admiral Kurita, watching from the bridge of the Yamato, faced an agonizing decision. The relentless air attacks had cost him precious time, and his force was being systematically destroyed. At 15:30 hours, he made the painful choice to reverse course, temporarily withdrawing from the battle to reassess his options. The Musashi's final moments came at 19-30-5 hours on October 24th. With her bow completely submerged and her stern rising high out of the water, she rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves, taking with her over 1,000 sailors, including the gallant Admiral Inoguchi. The loss of Japan's mightiest battleship sent shockwaves through the Imperial Navy and marked the beginning of the end for Japanese naval power in the Pacific. As darkness fell over Surigao Strait on the night of October 24th to 25th, Rear Admiral Jesse Barrett Oldendorf prepared for what would become the last great battleship engagement in naval history. His battle line, consisting of 6 battleships, 5 of them veterans of Pearl Harbor, seeking revenge, stretched across the northern entrance to the strait like a steel wall of retribution. The USS West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Tennessee, California, and Mississippi had been carefully positioned to execute the classic naval maneuver known as crossing the T, where the full broadside of the battle line could be brought to bear on approaching enemy ships that could only reply with their forward guns. It was a tactical formation that had decided naval battles since the age of sail, and now it would be employed with devastating modern efficiency. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force approached through the strait with grim determination. Knowing full well that he was sailing into a trap, his force consisted of the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and for destroyers. Behind him, several hours delayed, came Rear Admiral Kiyohitshima's second striking force with 3 cruisers and for destroyers. The Japanese plan called for both forces to break through simultaneously, but poor coordination and communication failures had already doomed the operation. Naval records from the National Archives, as documented in the Battle of Leyte Gulf by Thomas Cutler, revealed that Japanese radio communications were severely hampered throughout the operation, preventing effective coordination between the various attack forces. At 20-30-6 hours, the first contact was made. Captain Jesse Coward's destroyer squadron, consisting of 5 Fletcher-class destroyers, launched a coordinated torpedo attack against Nishimura's column. The USS Melvin, McDermott, Monson, Remy, and McGowan raced through the darkness at 35 knots, their crews working feverishly to prepare their Mark 15 torpedoes for launch. The night erupted in violence as the destroyers closed to within 6,000 yards before launching their deadly fish. 27 torpedoes streaked through the water toward the Japanese battle line. The destroyer Michishio, struck by multiple torpedoes, exploded in a spectacular fireball that illuminated the entire strait. The Asagumo, severely damaged, fell out of formation and began to settle by the stern. But the most devastating blow came when torpedoes from the USS Melvin struck the battleship Fuso. The massive explosion broke the 34,000-ton warship in half, creating separate fires that continued to burn on the water. For hours afterward, American radar operators tracked what they believed to be 2 different ships, not realizing they were observing the bow and stern sections of a single battleship continuing to burn as they drifted apart. Admiral Oldendorf, watching the radar plot from his flagship USS Louisville, could hardly believe the effectiveness of the destroyer attack. The Japanese formation appears to be completely disrupted. He reported to Admiral Kincaid, "We are preparing to engage with the battle line." At 0-3-50-1 hours on October 25th, the USS West Virginia's 14-inch guns opened fire at a range of 22,800 yards. The salvo was followed seconds later by the thunderous broadsides of the other battleships, their 16-inch and 14-inch guns hurling massive shells toward the approaching Japanese ships. The night sky was split by the brilliant flashes of heavy naval gunfire, and the sound of the bombardment could be heard 50 miles away. The Japanese flagship Yamashiro, already damaged by torpedo hits, fought back courageously. Her 14-inch guns replied to the American fire, straddling several targets but achieving no hits. Vice Admiral Nishimura, realizing his mission was doomed but determined to die fighting, continued to press forward into the teeth of the American formation. The unequal battle lasted less than 20 minutes. The Yamashiro, overwhelmed by the concentrated fire of 6 battleships and 8 cruisers, rolled over and sank with Admiral Nishimura still on the bridge. The heavy cruiser Mogami, severely damaged and on fire, managed to escape to the south, only to be finished off by air attacks the following day. When Admiral Shima's force finally arrived, they found the strait filled with burning wreckage and oil slicks. After a brief, confused engagement in which his flagship collided with the damaged Mogami, Shima wisely withdrew, bringing the Battle of Surigao Strait to its conclusion. Dawn on October 25th broke clear and bright over the waters east of Samar, revealing a scene that would test American naval courage to its very limits. At 0-6-40-5 hours, lookouts aboard the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay spotted the unmistakable pagoda masts of Japanese battleships emerging from a rain squall just 18 miles away. Admiral Kurita's center force, having reversed course during the night and slipped through San Bernardino Strait undetected, was bearing down on the vulnerable escort carriers of Taffy III with murderous intent. Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague, commanding the 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers of Task Unit 70-7-4-3, faced the nightmare scenario that every naval commander dreaded. His small, slow escort carriers, converted merchant ships designed to provide air support for the invasion, were about to face the most powerful surface force the Japanese Navy could muster. The odds were overwhelming for battleships including the mighty Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers against his tiny force. "My God, they've got us," Sprague exclaimed as the full magnitude of the Japanese force became apparent. The Yamato alone displaced more tonnage than his entire task unit combined. But Sprague was a fighter, and he immediately began issuing orders that would turn his desperate defense into one of the most heroic actions in naval history. The escort carriers Fanshawe Bay, Salo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkin Bay, and Gambier Bay turned south and increased speed to their maximum 18 knots while launching every available aircraft. The destroyers USS Hull, Herman, and Johnston, along with the destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, John C. Butler, and Dennis, prepared to charge directly at the approaching Japanese battle line in a suicidal attempt to buy time for the carriers to escape. Commander Ernest Eugene Evans, captain of the USS Johnston, was the first to act. Without waiting for orders, he turned his ship toward the enemy and increased speed to flank. Black smoke pouring from his stacks. "All hands to general quarters. We're going in," he announced over the ship's communication system. His 300-man crew, many of them barely out of their teens, manned their battle stations with grim determination. The Johnston opened fire at 14,000 yards, her 5-inch guns barking defiance at the massive Japanese warships. Her 10 torpedoes, launched at the heavy cruiser Kumano, scored multiple hits that sent the enemy's ship limping out of the battle with her bow blown off. But Evans knew his ship was doomed the moment he decided to attack. Within minutes, 14-inch and 16-inch shells from Japanese battleships began falling around the destroyer like deadly rain. According to testimony preserved in the Naval Historical Center's oral history collection, Seaman First Class Robert Bailey later recalled, "The skipper came on the horn and told us we were going to attack the whole Japanese fleet. We thought he was crazy, but we followed him into hell because we trusted him." The USS Hull, under Commander Leon Kintberger, followed the Johnston into the maelstrom. Her crew fought their ship with incredible bravery, continuing to fire even as Japanese shells tore through her thin armor. When her forward guns were knocked out, her crew shifted to the aftermount. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, though designed for anti-submarine warfare and equipped with only the 5-inch guns, charged into battle alongside the fleet destroyers. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, had trained his crew to fight like a battleship, and they did not disappoint. For over an hour, the Sammy B traded shots with Japanese heavy cruisers, her accurate gunfire causing significant damage to the cruiser Chikuma. As the small American ships fought their desperate battle, the escort carriers continued south, their flight decks bustling with activity as every available aircraft was launched into combat. Pilots took off with whatever ordnance was available, armor-piercing bombs meant for land targets, depth charges designed for submarines, and even empty rockets that could still cause psychological damage to enemy gunners. The sight of these tiny American ships charging fearlessly into battle against overwhelming odds had a profound psychological effect on the Japanese commanders. Admiral Kurita, expecting to find defenseless transport ships, instead encountered fierce resistance that suggested he had stumbled upon a major American force. The confusion and delay caused by this unexpected battle would ultimately cost the Japanese their best chance for victory. The morning battle off Samar reached its climax as the Japanese heavy cruisers, close to point-blank range with the fleeing American escort carriers, the Yamato's 18.1-inch shells, each weighing as much as a small automobile, began falling dangerously close to the USS Fanshawe Bay, sending towering columns of water high into the air. Admiral Sprague, still directing the desperate defense from his flagship, could see the colored splashes of dye markers from enemy shells, red from the Yamato, green from the Nagato, yellow from the Congo, creating a deadly rainbow around his small force. At 0820 hours, the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay became the first American ship to fall victim to the Japanese guns. Heavy cruiser Chikuma's 8-inch shells smashed through the thin armor of the converted merchant vessel, starting fires that quickly spread throughout the ship. Captain Walter Vuge ordered abandon ship at 0-9-0-7 hours, just as the carrier rolled over and began her final plunge to the ocean floor. Her aircraft, still circling overhead with no deck to land on, watched helplessly as their home disappeared beneath the waves. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagen, flying a Wildcat fighter from the doomed carrier, epitomized the desperate improvisation that characterized the American response. With his ammunition exhausted and no bombs or rockets remaining, he began making dry runs on Japanese ships, diving low over their bridges in an attempt to distract their gunners and disrupt their fire control. Other pilots followed his example, and soon the sky was filled with American aircraft making mock attacks with empty guns, their courage and determination creating chaos among the enemy formations. The destroyer USS Johnston, meanwhile, continued her heroic fight despite catastrophic damage. Commander Evans, wounded early in the battle when Japanese shells destroyed his ship's bridge, continued to direct the action from the after-steering position. With her forward guns knocked out, her speed reduced to 17 knots, and fires raging throughout the ship, the Johnston limped toward the Japanese formation for one final attack. Yeoman Sidney Flung, manning a 20mm gun on the Johnston's fantail, would later describe the surreal scene. "We could see the Jap sailors on their decks. They were so close. Our 5-inch guns were firing right over my head, and the noise was unbelievable. Shell fragments were flying everywhere, but we kept shooting because that's all we knew how to do." At 0-9-40-5 hours, the Johnston finally succumbed to her wounds. As she rolled over and began to sink, a Japanese destroyer captain, witnessing the incredible courage of the American crew, rendered honors by saluting the sinking ship, a gesture of respect rarely seen in the bitter Pacific War. Commander Evans went down with his ship, posthumously receiving the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary heroism. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts fought with equal gallantry until the very end. Her crew, many of whom had never seen combat before this battle, displayed remarkable courage under fire. When Japanese shells knocked out her steering gear, Coxswain Red Harrington crawled into the burning after-steering compartment and manually operated the rudder controls despite scalding steam and toxic smoke. The ship's pharmacist mate, who had no combat training, manned a 20mm gun and continued firing even as shell fragments peppered the deck around him. Combat records maintained by the Naval Historical Foundation document that the USS Samuel B. Roberts fired over 600 rounds of 5-inch ammunition during the battle, an extraordinary rate of fire for a ship of her size, earning her the nickname the Destroyer, escort that fought like a battleship. As the morning progressed, the tide of battle began to turn not through American firepower, which was hopelessly outmatched, but through the cumulative effect of constant air attacks and the growing confusion among Japanese commanders. Admiral Kurita, originally planning a swift strike against helpless transports, found himself engaged in a running battle with what appeared to be a major American task force. His ships were spread out over miles of ocean, their formations disrupted by torpedo attacks and constant harassment from American aircraft. The psychological impact of the American resistance was perhaps even more significant than the physical damage inflicted. Japanese officers, conditioned to expect quick victories against inferior opposition, were stunned by the ferocious resistance they encountered. Radio intercepts later revealed that many Japanese commanders believed they were fighting Admiral Halsey's main fleet, not a handful of escort carriers and destroyers. At 10:20 hours, with victory seemingly within his grasp, Admiral Kurita made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Believing he had accomplished his mission of disrupting the American invasion, and fearing air attacks from Halsey's returning carriers, he ordered his forces to withdraw through San Bernardino Strait, the greatest opportunity for Japanese naval victory since Pearl Harbor slipped away in the smoke and confusion of battle. As Admiral Kurita's battered center force retreated through San Bernardino Strait, a new and terrifying dimension was about to be added to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. At 10:51 hours on October 25th, Lieutenant Yukio Seki led the first organized kamikaze attack in history. His small force of 50 fighters, each carrying a 500-pound bomb, approaching the escort carriers of Taffy 1 from the northeast. The concept of organized suicide attacks had been proposed by Admiral Takejiro Onishi just 4 days earlier, born from the desperate realization that conventional tactics could no longer stop the overwhelming American advance. The special attack units, known as Shimpu or kamikaze in Japanese, represented the ultimate expression of Bushido, the way of the warrior, transformed into aerial warfare. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, watching from his headquarters on Luzon, had personally selected Lieutenant Seki to lead this first mission. At 23 years old, Seki was a veteran pilot with considerable combat experience, but he had initially resisted the idea of suicide attacks. "If we are ordered to die, we will die," he had told his fellow pilots. "But I wish for the young ones to be allowed to live and defend their homeland." The escort carriers of Taffy 1 Sangaman, Suwannee, Sani, and Petra Bay were operating approximately 50 miles south of their sister unit when the kamikazes appeared on radar. Rear Admiral Felix Stump, commanding the task unit, immediately ordered general quarters and began launching every available fighter aircraft. But the Japanese had timed their attack perfectly, catching the carriers during aircraft recovery operations, when their defensive capabilities were at their lowest ebb. At 10:53 hours, Lieutenant Seki dove his Zero directly into the flight deck of the USS St. Lo, one of the carriers that had escaped the surface action earlier that morning. The 500-pound bomb, combined with the aircraft's fuel and ammunition, detonated in the carrier's hangar deck among fully fueled and armed aircraft. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, sending a pillar of flame and smoke over a mile into the sky. Ensign Bill Brooks, standing on the bridge of the nearby USS Kitkin Bay, watched in horror as the St. Lo was consumed by internal explosions. "It was like watching a volcano erupt," he later recalled. "The whole ship seemed to lift out of the water, and when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but burning debris floating on the surface." According to official Navy casualty reports archived at the National Personnel Record Center, the USS St. Lo lost 113 officers and men in the kamikaze attack. Within minutes of Seki's successful strike, other kamikazes pressed home their attacks. The USS Suwannee was struck by another Zero that crashed into her flight deck, starting fires that took hours to control. The USS Sani took a kamikaze hit near her forward elevator, but her damage control parties managed to save the ship through heroic efforts. The USS Kitkin Bay was damaged by a near miss that showered her deck with flaming gasoline and aircraft parts. The psychological impact of these attacks was immediate and profound. American sailors, who had grown accustomed to fighting an enemy that valued survival and sought tactical advantage, were now facing opponents who sought death as eagerly as victory. The traditional rules of aerial combat no longer applied, when every enemy aircraft was potentially a guided missile piloted by a man determined to die. Commander David McCampbell, the fighter ace who had distinguished himself in the earlier air battles, was among the first to encounter the kamikazes in aerial combat. "They just kept coming," he reported. "Even when you hit them, even when they were on fire, they kept trying to reach their target." The success of these first kamikaze attacks sent shockwaves through the American fleet and changed the nature of Pacific warfare forever. No longer could American ships rely solely on their anti-aircraft guns and fighter cover for protection. They now faced an enemy willing to transform every aircraft into a weapon of mass destruction. Admiral Halsey, racing back from his pursuit of the Japanese carrier force, received the first reports of the kamikaze attacks with grim concern. They might be able to exact such a terrible toll on the American fleet that further advances would become prohibitively expensive. As the sun set on October 25, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf had witnessed the emergence of a new form of warfare that would plague the Pacific Fleet for the remainder of the war. The age of the kamikaze had begun, adding a terrifying new dimension to an already brutal conflict and foreshadowing the savage battles that lay ahead. As dawn broke on October 26, 1944, the waters around Leyte Gulf bore witness to one of the most complete naval victories in history. The 4-day battle had ended with the virtual destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force, but the cost in human lives and the emergence of kamikaze warfare cast long shadows over the American triumph. Admiral William Frederick Halsey Jr. stood on the bridge of the USS New Jersey, surveying the aftermath of the largest naval engagement ever fought. Around him, the Philippine Sea was littered with oil slicks, debris, and the occasional life raft carrying survivors from the dozens of ships sunk during the battle. His Third Fleet had pursued Admiral Ozawa's decoy force to the north, sinking for aircraft carriers including the Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, but at the cost of allowing Kurita's battleships to nearly reach the invasion beaches. The strategic implications of the Japanese defeat were staggering. In 4 days of fighting, the Imperial Navy had lost for aircraft carriers 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, over 100,000 tons of warships sent to the bottom. More critically, they had lost the majority of their remaining trained pilots and experienced naval personnel, resources that could never be replaced given Japan's shrinking industrial capacity and dwindling fuel supplies. Admiral Chester William Nimitz, reviewing the battle reports from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, recognized that Leyte Gulf marked the end of Japanese naval power in the Pacific. The enemy's ability to conduct major fleet operations has been eliminated. He cabled to Admiral Ernest Joseph King in Washington. The path to Japan now lies open. The Japanese combined fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, would never again sortie in significant strength. According to the classified communications preserved in the National Security Agency's historical archives, Japanese Naval Headquarters sent a final message to all remaining fleet units on October 27th. The backbone of the combined fleet has been broken. All units will conduct operations according to local commanders' discretion. For the Americans, victory had come at a significant but acceptable cost. The United States lost 1 light aircraft carrier, USS Princeton, to escort carriers USS Gambier Bay and St. Lo, to destroyers USS Hull and Johnston, 1 destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, and approximately 3,000 casualties. Against the backdrop of Japanese losses exceeding 12,000 men, the exchange ratio demonstrated the growing superiority of American naval power and tactics. But the emergence of kamikaze warfare introduced a disturbing new element into the Pacific conflict. The successful attacks on October 25th had proven that determined suicide pilots could penetrate even the strongest defenses, and Japanese commanders were already organizing additional special attack units throughout the Philippine Islands. What had begun as a desperate expedient would soon evolve into Japan's primary naval tactic. For the remainder of the war, Lieutenant General Douglas MacArthur, whose invasion of Leyte had prompted the Japanese naval sortie, was now free to consolidate his beachhead and prepare for the next phase of operations. The failure of Operation Victory No. 1 meant that Japanese ground forces on Leyte would receive no naval support and would have to fight a purely defensive campaign. Against overwhelming odds, the dream of stopping the American advance in the Philippines had died with the combined fleet. In the waters of Leyte Gulf, the battle's aftermath also revealed the critical importance of intelligence and communication in modern naval warfare. American codebreakers had provided advance warning of Japanese movements, while radar and radio intercepts allowed coordinated responses across hundreds of miles of ocean. In contrast, Japanese forces suffered from poor communication and lack of coordination that turned their complex plan into a series of isolated defeats. For the men who had fought the battle, the memories would last a lifetime. Survivors of the USS Johnston would speak with pride of their ship's final charge, while pilots from the escort carriers would remember the morning when they faced the entire Japanese battle line with empty guns and hearts full of courage. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had forged legends that would inspire naval officers for generations to come. As the damaged ships limped back to port and the casualty lists were compiled, one fact became clear to all who had participated: they had witnessed the passing of an era. The age of the battleship which had dominated naval warfare for half a century, was ending. The future belonged to aircraft carriers, guided missiles, and the terrible new weapons that would soon transform warfare forever. But for 4 days in October 1944, the old ships and the brave men who sailed them had written the final chapter of the great naval battles, and they had written it in victory.